Recently, I made a video looking at the Islamic Golden Age, the time when, under the rule of the Abbasid Caliphate, Islamic culture really flourished and gave the world a lot of lasting and memorable things. Well, the Abbasid Caliphate itself was a political failure. And in this video, I want to trace out the origins of its decline and fall, and also look at the consequences of that steep decline. One of them is that while the Abbasid Caliphate still existed as the main power of the Islamic world, it would actually have atrophied so much by the time of the First Crusade and the rise of the Mongols that it was virtually irrelevant. So let's talk about why it was irrelevant, and also look at the powers that had become relevant in the Islamic world during the time of the Crusades and also the Mongol invasions. First, it's really worth thinking about how the Abbasid Caliphate came into being in the first place, and that was by playing on tensions which existed inside of the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, from about 730 on, the Umayyad Caliphate had problems between Arabs and Berbers all across the Caliphate, but especially in the West, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about medieval Spain and the turmoil that broke out shortly after the conquest of Spain. Now, there also became some differences among different Arab groups. So, some of the Arabs who went to the West early were then at odds with Arabs who arrived later. So that does create more tension, in addition to the Arab versus Berber tension that had already been at play. We also see that there are differences over interpretations of Islam starting in this period. We've already talked about how there were, we have the Battle of Karbala in 680 and the formation of the Shia version of Islam as opposed to the Sunni. So those tensions are still around, and the rise of the Umayyads did not deal with those issues and to the satisfaction of many people. So that's another source of dissension. And then there are a few additional sources of religious tension that I don't want to get into because they are a bit more complex, and I don't really have a strong enough background in, Islamic religious thought to really explain it well. So basically what the Abbasids did is they played on a lot of the religious tension in the Middle East itself, ignoring a lot of the issues out on the peripheries, and they rode that religious tension to victory after a couple years in a civil war. And when they get to power, they don't really do all that much to address a lot of these underlying issues. Other issues then crop up and add on to those issues. And between all of those things, the fact that this caliphate became very prone to division is not really all that surprising. So let's look at some of the core problems which really helped to undermine the Abbasid regime over time. One issue which faces almost all monarchies at some point is the issue of establishing political and religious legitimacy. And that is something that the Abbasid Caliphate struggled with. Now, some of the early caliphs were pretty good about this, but this was something that required a lot of constant maintenance and capable leadership, and in any kind of dynasty, you're never going to have that on a consistent and fairly non-stop basis. Another thing which happens is that Islam grew beyond Arab domination. Now, Islam did grow up in an Arab context. However, as a universalist religion, anyone can become an equal in the community of Islam by converting. Therefore, Arab ancestry is not really something that you need to be prominent within this community. And at this point, we see that other Muslims, like Persian Muslims, Berber Muslims, and others, are starting to seek power because they realize that by the rules of their own religion, they're equal to the Arabs who originally spread this religion to them. Now, another problem for the Abbasid Caliphate, and this one is maybe a little bit less their fault than it sounds at first, they didn't really develop a strong enough central government that would enable them to keep distant governors in check or maintain a caliphal army that could keep order all across the realm. Now, some of the early caliphs were fairly good about this, but the reason why they were able to do it is because they were very active rulers. so they came of age before they hit the throne, and they had good health, and they were intelligent and, you know, normally developed. If you have all those factors come into play, then you can pull this off to some extent. You also have to have loyal servants, especially high-ranking ones, to pull this stuff off for you. So if all these factors don't align, then it's very hard to keep the system going. One way around that would be to develop something like a really effective bureaucracy, which could you know, sort of run itself like a modern European nation. Belgium had a government shutdown several years ago, and everybody still got their paychecks. Everybody was still able to go to parks and all that kind of stuff, even though the government was not really functioning legislatively on any level. If you can get to that level of bureaucracy, it actually can make up for bad leadership at the top to some extent. However, the Abbasids were never able to quite get there, and in many ways that's more a reflection of the limitations of the medieval state than really the fault of the rulers. However, if you're looking for a major issue to crop up when trying to govern a state of that size, you really do need a large and powerful government in order to keep that in check and intact. Now, one of the major problems for trying to govern, and another thing that's definitely not the fault of the people who were ruling the empire at the time, is that they needed a better communication network. Now, they could have expedited communication to a greater extent by focusing on road building. That's what the Romans did, after all, and the Romans also were able to really utilize the sea routes of the Mediterranean to great effect. However, really, if you're going to be running an empire the size of the Caliphate, you would need more advanced communication technology, and that's not something that they had. Now, because of these problems, and because not all caliphs are created equal, what we see is that every time there's a weak caliph, local governors all over the Caliphate will take advantage and diminish the power of the caliph, and then his successors, regardless of their capacities, will be in a weakened position and won't be able to do much. Then when they're replaced by someone weaker, they again will lose more power and then pass on less power. So it becomes a vicious cycle. And what we see is that the caliph went from being the legitimate secular lord of all of this land just to being basically the mayor of Baghdad and the head of the House of Wisdom, like the college chancellor. And basically they held those two roles by 1258 with a lot of religious authority, but in a vague way where people could kind of ignore them if they wanted to. So that's basically where they were at by the end. So if anything, Abbasid political history is somewhat depressing because it's just a constant slide once you get past the first few really active caliphs. So now let's look at some of the other things which brought this whole house of cards crashing down. Due to the expansive borders of the Abbasid Caliphate, it had many frontiers, and there were always wars to be fought. So, starting in the 9th century, the Abbasids began to enslave Turkic steppe peoples living on their borders and to use them as Mamluks. Mamluks are basically slave soldiers who are converted to Islam and then served the caliph personally. So this was one way that some of the early caliphs sought an independent power base which didn't rely on some of their more free subjects. This was a way to try to enhance the power of the state. And to some extent, it kind of made sense at first. The problem is, as this becomes a major new source of military power, many Arabs and Berbers became demilitarized. And in the long run, this meant that the native populations were now vulnerable to any kind of revolt or revolution on the part of the Mamluks. Keep in mind, Islam is not racially or ethnically exclusive, so if you're a Mamluk slave soldier and you see an opportunity to take power, there's nothing to prevent you from doing that. The stigma about you being a Mamluk is not really as strong as you might think. Now, there's a stigma, sure, but it's not enough to prevent you from trying to seize power or serve as the power behind the throne. And we'll see that the Mamluks all across the Islamic world for many centuries will, in many cases, set up little kingdoms or seize power or do things of that nature. So a good idea at first, and then it turned out to be a bit of a disaster for the leaders of the Arab Muslim Caliphate. But before everything starts sliding into the abyss, let's look at the Abbasids at their best. So, the first 25 years or so from 750 to 775, the Abbasids were struggling to establish their legitimacy. People still had a lot of questions about them. So, once you get past that, though, you reach their peak from about 100 years, from 775 to 861. And that is also a time when you happen to have a series of strong and active caliphs who can go out and promote themselves and defend their interest in person. The three biggest ones are a father, son, and grandson team, and they did the best out of all of the Abbasid rulers. Harun al-Rashid ruled from 786 to 813, and he was a successful commander against the Byzantines. He won most of his battles against them, and he also presided over the capture of the island of Cyprus. That island would go back and forth. Sometimes they would have agreements where they would basically share the island between the Caliphate and the Byzantines. It got really complicated, but this was one time when the Abbasids were able to seize it. His son Al-Mamun, after fighting a civil war against his brother, came to full power, and he took his father's personal library and turned it into the House of Wisdoms. That's his most lasting legacy. But in his own time, he may have been as much known, or even better known, for mostly defending the Caliphate successfully against Byzantine attacks. The Byzantines at that time had resumed the offensive, and Al-Mamun was able to hold the line successfully. Al-Mamun passed on the empire to his son Al-Mutasim, who ruled for 9 years from 833 to 842. And he is the first of the caliphs to start hiring Mamluks. So at first it looked like a good idea, and it was what enabled him to really take it to the Byzantines even more than his father and grandfather had. At one point he was able to lay siege to Constantinople. Of course he didn't succeed. None of the Arab, Viking, or Russian sieges of Constantinople ever quite got anywhere. But he did manage to get behind the Byzantine frontier and destroy the major city in Asia Minor called Amorium. And that was a fairly major blow to the Byzantines, because that was one of the few prosperous cities that they had left at this time. So for Al-Mutasim, that was the crown jewel in his collection, if you will. So everything is going pretty well for the Abbasids up until the year 861 or so. And then they have a series of weak caliphs and strong governors. Anytime you have a weak central authority and strong local authority, this is devastating to state unity, and you see that state become weaker. Well, this period is no exception. And what we see are a bunch of caliphs that I wouldn't bother naming. Even if I had an infinite amount of time to make videos about all of them, I wouldn't bother, because most of these guys are totally weak and forgettable. The only notable ruler during this time was Al-Mu'tadid. He ruled from 892 to 902. And he was able to actually do quite a bit to restore the Caliphate's power in his fairly short reign. He put down numerous revolts and restored a lot of governors to the full allegiance to the Caliphate. However, because he only ruled for 10 years, he didn't really live long enough to fully stem the tide of this decline and division. And after his death, another weak caliph assumed the throne, and the process regenerated and all of his work was lost. That is one of his coins on the left. I figured, he deserves some mention for at least being competent. After Al-Mu'tadid died, it didn't take long for these tensions and these tendencies towards division to really manifest themselves in new, effectively independent states. Now, in theory, most of the states I'm going to talk about now actually did claim to be vassals of the Abbasids, but in reality, they kind of did what they wanted to, and they used the Abbasids as props for their own regime, because the Abbasids by this point couldn't really do all that much. Now, the Buyids are the first and most notable of this group. They were around from 934 to 1062. And they are centered in Iran, which had already become mostly Shia. It's still mostly Shia to this day. And so this became sort of the first Shia Islamic state. They also took up their Persian heritage, and they revived a lot of Sasanian customs, and the ruler of the Buyids called himself the Shahanshah, the King of Kings. The most important of the Buyid rulers was a guy named Adud al-Dawa, who ruled from 949 to 983, and his name translates to Pillar of the Dynasty, and the dynasty being referred to as the Abbasids. So while we look at his dynasty as being an independent state, because that's effectively what it was, his propaganda and his self-label is as someone who was there to prop up the Abbasid dynasty as it struggled to maintain itself. So that's worth noting. The Abbasids did have an established claim to legitimacy, but that legitimacy was mostly religious rather than political. So the people who were actually destroying the Abbasid state were trying to sell themselves to the people as upholders of the Abbasids. So we're going to see that happen more and more. The heavy importation of Turkic people from the steppes and the consequent demilitarization of the native Arabs and Berbers led to the rise of the Seljuk Turks as being a major force within the Islamic world. And from a combination of people who were serving as mercenaries / slave soldiers in the Islamic ranks and outside Seljuk leaders, the Seljuks were able to more or less completely overrun the Abbasid Caliphate during the early 11th century, thus creating the Seljuk Empire, which ran from about 1034 until about 1092 or so. Now in 1092, there was a ruler named Malik Shah, and when he died, his empire was divided 4 ways among his followers. The most important for our purposes of these followers, and the best recorded of them, was the guy who was left in charge of Asia Minor, named Khalij Arslan I, who you can read about in Anna Karenina's The Alexiad or other sources about the First Crusade. And he actually was the first Islamic opponent that the First Crusade ran across. The offshoot of the Seljuk Empire, led by Khalij Arslan, is usually referred to as the Sultanate of Rum. Rum is sort of a Turkish word for Rome, and obviously, as you remember, the Byzantines still referred to themselves as the Romans, so that is what this refers to. And sometimes you'll hear their homeland in Turkey itself referred to as the region of Rum. This is where that comes from. The Seljuk state in Anatolia was founded following the Battle of Manzikert, which I'll talk about in one of my subsequent Byzantine videos as we update the Byzantines until the First Crusade. They won a smashing victory at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, and then followed it up with some really brilliant diplomacy, which by 1095 had booted the Byzantines almost entirely from Asia Minor. I don't know if they had any possessions left, but if they did, they were extremely minimal. And it was in that situation that led the Byzantines to request aid from the West, but we'll get to that story later. Now, as the Crusaders began to arrive in 1096 and 1097, the first people they encountered and fought were the Seljuk Turks under Khalij Arslan, as I mentioned above. And the Sultanate of Rum would really last for a while, and it was only really broken by the power of the Mongols in the 13th century, and then later they would face a rebellion by a guy named Osman, who founded a dynasty, a very obscure one, later known as the Ottomans. So these guys sort of set the precedent for what would later become the Ottoman Empire, but we'll talk about that later, since that is very much a different story for a different day. The first place that the authority of the Abbasids collapsed was in the West. We've already talked about how the Umayyads went there in the 750s, the survivors of the Umayyads that is, and established their own emirate in Spain. Well, there were other groups which were discontent with Abbasid rule, and we've already talked about how the Berbers were already trying to really separate themselves from the Arabs. Well, this first manifests itself early in the 900s, when the Fatimids, who claimed descent from Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, rebelled in what is now Algeria. And from Algeria in 909, they spread all the way to the coastal Near East. So by the time we get to the First Crusade in the late 1090s, the Fatimids own everything from Algeria in the west to Jerusalem and Antioch, and then also parts of Saudi Arabia, or what's now Saudi Arabia, by that time. Now, they, because of their claimed kinship to Muhammad through Fatima, claimed that they had religious authority over the Muslim Ummah or community rather than the Abbasids. So they came up with their own justification for their rule and their defiance of the Abbasids. So while the Abbasids were mostly recognized as religiously legitimate, their claim was not exclusive, and it didn't satisfy everyone, and here is the ultimate example of them not satisfying a group in their empire. Not to mention, they also failed to address the Arab-Berber question, and that was another source of Fatimid power. Now, the Fatimids themselves, by playing up the Berber aspect of their identity, were then troubled by problems within their own ranks between Turks, Berbers, and Arabs. And also their legitimacy was badly damaged when they failed to defend the Holy Land from the Crusaders, seeing as how they lost both Antioch and Jerusalem. However, they did manage to cling on to power for quite a while until Saladin, the famous figure from the Third Crusade, actually finished them off in the year 1171. However, this is another state that you kind of need to know a little bit about if you're going to actually look at the Crusades and understand it very well. So we've already seen that the Abbasid Caliphate was more or less irrelevant to the First Crusade and also to the conflict in Spain between the Muslim and Christian states there. So that should hopefully give you a different picture of how religious conflict in this period worked and the role of the Abbasids. Now, while on the maps we've seen earlier it looks like the Abbasids just lost ground in the west and were okay in the east, that's definitely not the case. We already saw the Buyids earlier, and they set a precedent which will be followed by many others. The next group to rise up in the east are the Ghaznavids, and they arise from the presence of lots of Turkic Mamluks in this area. And there is a Ghaznavid dynasty which is founded and forms into an empire by about the year 977. Now, just like the Buyids, this group will become heavily Persianized and really try to act like a revived Sasanian Empire. However, this time they're Islamic, so that's the new thing that they have going for them that distinguishes them. This group will actually center its rule around Afghanistan. Militarily, the Ghaznavids are very interesting. They combine the steppe tactics of the Turks with Arab raiding tactics and Afghan mountain infantry, so they had a pretty good diversity of troop types, and that made them fairly formidable. They reached their peak, as seen on the map, about the year 1030 or so, and they were basically just a Central Asian powerhouse. But then they collapsed by about 1186, so they also actually did not end up surviving the Abbasid Caliphate, which is interesting. Well before the Ghaznavid Empire reached its peak, a group called the Khwarazmians broke away in 1077 and formed their own little state, and then they managed to surge to prominence after they inflicted some defeats on the Seljuks in the early 13th century. Now, by 1218, the Khwarazmians had become a fairly major power in Iran and in Central Asia. They had a capital at Samarkand, which will become one of the great cities of the Middle Ages, and they were fresh off of conquest in Persia and Afghanistan. There was a very bright future, a clear line of succession. You had a ruler in his prime, and then a son who was already in his early 20s and completely healthy, competent, all that stuff. So everything looked great. And then this state would be wiped clean out by the Mongols as the first victim of Genghis Khan's expansion out of Mongolia. So, like a lot of states which fall to great conquerors, Persia to Alexander and the Khwarazmian Empire to the Mongols, these are states which actually fell in their prime and not at some point where they were weakened and tottering. Anyway, the Khwarazmians are another example of a state that was formed due to the political failure of the Abbasid Caliphate. Obviously, this also shows that the other breakaway states also failed to address the problems that the Abbasids had not resolved either. So, and I wonder, what if the Abbasid Caliphate had been fully in charge of all of this territory in their caliphate when the Mongols came out of Mongolia? How different would history be? We'll never know. Speaking of the Mongols, they came back in 1258 during the invasion of the Middle East by the Ilkhanate, and they managed to destroy Baghdad and the House of Wisdom. The loss of the House of Wisdom is one of the greatest cultural losses in human history, and it's perfectly debatable as to how much was lost, but it's pretty safe to say that it was a lot, and that the loss of the House of Wisdom is at least as bad, if not worse, when compared to the loss of the library at Alexandria. And this event, of course, marks the end of the Islamic Golden Age, and it also marks the official end of Abbasid political relevance. However, the Abbasids actually were not 100% finished yet. They actually have a little bit of an afterlife. What does that look like? Let's take a look. By the 13th century, Mamluks had taken over Egypt as well and set up their own dynasty, and they were looking for a way to legitimate themselves. So a few years after the fall of Baghdad in 1261, they invited the Abbasids to come to Cairo and serve as props for their regime. Now, the Abbasids in Egypt were basically sort of comparable to the popes or the Patriarch of Constantinople or something like that, in that their authority was strictly religious and not at all political. So this was a major downgrade from their status back at Baghdad. However, it is still a pretty good post, since you basically get paid for being born with a certain last name. So, kind of cool if you're the Abbasids. Now, the Abbasid period in Egypt lasts all the way until 1517, when the Ottoman Sultan Selim the Grim would conquer Egypt and then depose the Abbasid Caliph. The last Abbasid Caliph was Al-Mutawakkil III, and he was forced to go to Istanbul, the former city formerly known as Constantinople, and he was forced to hand over his caliphal powers and symbols like Muhammad's sword and mantle to Selim, thus sort of symbolically passing leadership of the Muslim Ummah onto the Ottoman sultans. So that was the end of the Abbasids. And also for Al-Mutawakkil, he returned to Cairo and lived until about the 1540s. Then he died, and I believe, and I might not be right about this, but I believe that he was the last of his line and that there are no more Abbasids now. But anyway, their time in Egypt wasn't really that interesting anyway, so I guess it wasn't that great of a loss, all things considered. And that's it for the Abbasids. Hopefully this has helped to set a good context for the Crusades and the Mongols, and this will really help to understand why the Crusaders and the Mongols, at least part of why they were able to succeed